We're now into topic number 7, balance of payments, debt, and macroeconomic stabilization. But the first thing you should notice is that our focus will be on Mexico. Mexico is a natural case study for this chapter from my perspective. Prior to the 1970s, Mexico was not really interested in international trade. Mexico was very nationalistic. Like most of the Latin American countries, the development was inward focused. If you remember from chapter 12, there was a conversation about import substitution industrialization. And many countries that thought they had the resources preferred to focus on developing their own resources for their people and developing a policy that was, as I said, inward focused. I would say that this policy of import substitution industrialization has pretty much died, but it was mainly pioneered in Latin America. Some of the names associated with this approach are Hans Singer and Raul Prebisch. What makes the story of Mexico fascinating to me is that it is very much entangled with a commodity that I say is the most important discovery in our world, oil. For a long time, Mexico has had oil as one of its natural resources. But I think that Mexico was not as keen about oil as other countries like the United States. The Mexican oil is a lower grade of oil, and a lot of it is hard to mine because it is so deep into the ground, and as a result, the cost of extracting the oil and processing this oil to make gasoline and other refined products was more expensive. And oil was cheap in the global economy, and if something is expensive for you to produce and it's cheaper to import that thing, then rational theory says that you would choose to import it. So as you look at the resources on Mexico, I want you to think oil, and to help you with the thinking, I want you to start around the 1970s. Recall that in 1973, the Arab-Israeli War in the fall of 1973 resulted in oil prices quadrupling. I like to say, imagine the price of oil was $2.50 a barrel, and the quadrupling would take the price to $10 a barrel. In the late 70s, the Iran hostage crisis and other factors caused oil prices to quadruple again. So imagine going from $10 to $40 a barrel. We know that in 2007, oil prices again skyrocketed. Nothing to do with demand and supply, but that's another story for another time. It had to do with banks and holding companies hoarding supplies of oil, and oil prices rose as high as $147 per barrel. So as you think that through, you will see that since the 1970s, oil has become a more precious commodity, and the price has certainly risen to represent the fact that this is an important commodity. Of course, you have to bring OPEC into the picture, and because in 1973 OPEC caused the oil prices to increase, I like to make up my own fiction and say that the Arabs kicked the Americans and the Westerners out of their oil fields, and because the supply went down, the price went up very fast, and that is all because of the inelastic demand curve. So if you can visualize a pretty much vertical demand curve and a reduction in supply, you can see where the price will jump substantially for a small decline in quantity. I think that we focused on this when we introduced the idea of immeasurizing growth. We talked about supplies increasing and prices falling precipitously. Well, reverse that analogy and think of supply declining and prices rising substantially. Well, again, there were two of these crises in the 1970s, and something that is expensive for you to mine now has such a high price that it is cost effective for you to go ahead and mine this thing. So Mexico became rich, I would say, off of the drilling of oil and the production of petroleum products. Even if the cost was high, the revenue was higher, and therefore Mexico became an exporter of oil. But Mexico was not a member of OPEC, and that is another interesting feature to think through, but I need to tell the OPEC story. So the OPEC countries reduced the supply of oil and got rich in the process, but if you could imagine areas where it's largely desert, there's not a lot of economic activity apart from oil, individuals who are not accustomed to this high consumption oriented lifestyle, they're making all of this money, and the question is, what do you do with this money? Well, I like to say they could have built cities in the deserts and castles in the desert. We know Dubai is one of these in more recent times. But what they chose to do with this windfall of petrodollars, it's called, is to invest it in American banks, or save it in American banks. For those of you who know much about banking, in the 1970s, there was not interstate banking, so American banks on the coast could not have branches and invest in other banks in the Midwest, for example. And as a result, the banks that received the money, mainly New York banks, had to do something with it. They could lend it internationally because there was no law preventing them from doing that, but they could not lend it within the United States outside of the areas where it was received. So these petrodollars were recycled, and many of them went to other developing countries. I should say that the high price of oil hurt many countries, and because oil is so important to producing pretty much everything, there was a global recession in 1974, and then there was a global recession in 1980 as a result of these two oil price shocks, they're called, in the Middle East, resulting in higher oil prices globally and world recession. Of course, if you were an oil exporter, you got rich. You got to export oil, and if you were not a member of OPEC, then you could do whatever you wanted. So you could increase the supply when OPEC was reducing the supplies amongst OPEC members. Obviously, OPEC will not like you for doing this, but they could do nothing about it except encourage you to join. So OPEC was largely Middle Eastern countries, and then there was one in Africa, that was Nigeria. There was one in the Pacific area, that was Indonesia, and there was one in South America, that was Venezuela. Over the course of history, different countries have joined or left OPEC, but for all practical purposes, that was the constitution of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So back to our Mexico story. As you look at Moodle, you'll see the articles that I have for you to look at, a case study of Mexico produced by the authors of the textbook. This will be, as I said, the brunt of the chapter, so you want to pay very close attention to this. Within the chapter there's a section on Mexico. Then I have an article called Chronology of the 1982 Mexican Financial Crisis. This is the gist of the chapter as far as I'm concerned. So the stuff I told you about the 1970s is leading up to 1982, the Mexican financial crisis. This will be the first of several global crises that we will focus on, but this is a good segue into the macroeconomic issues that can arise, and this will lead us into the next chapter as well when we focus on financial policy. What I need for you to do is to think about the Mexican financial crises from different perspectives. So if you can think of it from a Mexican perspective, also from maybe an American perspective, and then perhaps from a third world perspective outside of Mexico, or from a first world perspective outside of Mexico. So what I've provided here is three aspects or three vignettes that focus on the Mexican crisis of the 1990s. I should tell you that the individual who was the finance minister in Mexico during the 1982 crisis became one of my professors after he got fired from being finance minister. The University of Illinois was a haven for fired Latin American finance ministers, and that's another story. We had a faculty member named Warner Bear who was a big name in Latin America, and he was well connected with everyone in Latin America. As a result, when high officials found that they needed to transition, they would come and hide out at the University of Illinois while they redid their resumes and at least get a title, no pay, but get a title where they got to hint that they were doing something important. But mainly it was to retool and to recover from whatever maladies had affected their careers. Many Latin American finance ministers got fired because the crises in Latin America were prominent, extremely prominent, and solving these crises was bigger than one or two individuals could handle, and as a result there was a lot of collateral damage, I would say. So as you look at the Mexican crisis, I would like you to focus on the 1994 crisis. So if you take a look at the case study that I put together, you will notice the Mexican financial crisis from a Mexican perspective, and then there's the perspective contained in Daniel Yergin's Commanding Heights, and then there's another perspective contained in the crash. So I say the key video segments for this particular chapter will be from Commanding Heights and a video called The Crash. Yes, these materials are dated, but it is pretty much important economic history and history of financial crises, and that is why I want you to focus so intently on this content. So that is the gist of where you need to focus. I would say the more time you spend studying the Mexican case, the better your investment will be. Of course, there are other key topics in this chapter: foreign exchange market analysis, balance of payments analysis, foreign exchange crises, and then there is global contagion. How what happens in one country can spread to another country, and how the world's financial system can be affected by one phenomenon in one location because of the globalization of finance. So that is the gist of where I'd like for you to focus, and I hope that this vignette or this introduction gives you a sense as to the flavor of where the course is going. So the first topic will be balance of payments analysis, and this will be to inform you, if you haven't been informed, about what the balance of payments is and how it works. And then we'll move on from what is pretty much a current account focus, exports minus imports, to an overall financial markets focus in terms of foreign exchange markets. And we'll talk about theories that connect countries together. So the exchange rate is going to be a prime variable to focus on. International interest rates obviously in the background, but there are two theories that I need for you to focus on, and they're purchasing power parity, which is a theory that says prices around the world are linked together, and exchange rates is the mediating variable that ties these prices together. And then there's interest rate parity, and this is more of a capital account theory, whereas purchasing power parity is a current account theory, and it focuses on interest rates instead of prices. So interest rates around the world are linked together, and the exchange rate is the mediating variable in this particular equation. A lot of content. In fact, it is pretty much an entire course in one or two chapters, and this is par for the course. So the international trade chapter was pretty much a course that we have on the books, and now this international finance chapter is another course that we have. If you've taken these courses in trade and finance, then this will be a revision for you. But if you haven't, then there's a lot of learning to take place. The key is not to be bogged down with all of the details of these topics, but to get the gist of how developing countries are affected in these phenomena and in these circumstances. Again, the key focus is on developing countries, so don't get lost in all of the details of the theories. Okay, so I will communicate with you a little more on this. Please pay close attention to the Mexican case, and that will get you through most of what you need for your exam.